All right, welcome everyone. My name is Marissa Calderon. I'm Executive Director of the NCRC Community Development Fund, and I also hold a, I feel like my mic just went off. I also hold a, they're signaling me something in the back there. Yeah, there you go. I am also Chief of Community Finance and Mobility for NCRC, for the parent company of the CDFI. Thank you all for joining us today for this really exciting conversation. With me today, I have a really exceptional panel of speakers. Lenwood, unfortunately, couldn't be with us, had some flight issues, so he won't be joining us today. But I'd love to introduce you to Blackled Gupta. Blackled is President and CEO of Pacific Community Ventures, a nonprofit impact investor and community development financial institution. She's a 20-year veteran of the industry. Under Blacked's leadership, PCV has doubled their community investing and business advising portfolios and recommitted to addressing racial wealth gaps through a good jobs agenda. So thank you so much for joining us, Blackled. Marla Bolanek is also with us, and Marla is President and CEO of the National Association for Latino Community Asset Builders, who many of us know as NALCAB. Prior to joining NALCAB, Marla served as Executive Director of the Latino Economic Development Center in Washington, D.C., and has been a board member of NALCAB since 2016. And also with us today is the incomparable Donna Gambrell. Donna is a legend and is President and CEO of Appalachian Community Capital, where she's responsible for attracting and directing investments to CDFIs and other mission-driven lenders in Appalachia. She's also the longest-serving and first African-American woman to be appointed Director of the U.S. Department of Treasury CDFI Fund. So please join me in welcoming everyone. Just to kind of set a little bit of context, established in 1994 through a bipartisan act of Congress, the CDFI Fund vision is for an America in which all people and communities have access to the investment capital and financial services they need to prosper. In our conversation today, we'll discuss the origins of the industry before the fund, whether and how now, 28 years later, CDFIs are positioned to accomplish the mission codified by the fund. So Donna, long before there was a CDFI fund, community activists organized in church basements and local businesses, establishing institutions to bank the unbankable and provide access to capital to marginalized communities. Can you provide some context on the history of the community development movement that led up to what we now know as the community development finance industry?
Happy to do so. And first of all, good morning, everyone. I have to tell you how thrilled I am to see people in person. I haven't been out. I felt like a mushroom for the last 2.5 years. I'm trying to get my travel muscle back into gear and forgetting that there are certain protocols. So I was actually here on time and then had to get tested, which absolutely makes sense. So my apologies for running in like the wind at the last minute. So good to see everybody, and so good to be here to talk about the role of CDFIs, where we are at the industry, and really recentering our efforts to where we began, to our roots. Ramona is here from Mississippi, and we were talking about this earlier, about just how important it is to not forget the history of the CDFI movement and where we started. And so when you look back, and certainly the origins can go back as far as the 19th century, where you saw in neighborhoods, particularly neighborhoods of color, Black, African-American communities, where there was a lack of financial institutions, a lack of affordable access to funding. People were segregated in particular areas of communities and did not have a way of looking at opportunities, frankly, that would allow them home ownership or to create small businesses or to get further their education. And so what you saw at the very early stages were the creations of minority depository institutions in particular. Black banks, Black-owned banks, and I can't, as difficult as it is to start a bank today, I can't even imagine what it might have been like, 100 years ago. And in fact, one of the banks that still exists today, the longest operational bank in the country is Citizens Bank in Nashville, Kentucky. Sorry, Nashville, Tennessee, created in 1904 and continues to operate today. And they were created primarily to provide African Americans an economic opportunity, to help build wealth, to help create assets, to provide a longevity for generational wealth. All the things that we're talking about today were things that were present, 100 years ago or more. And so as you see that evolution, you see the role that these institutions have played, not only for minority, black-owned, brown-owned banks, but also as you look through that arc that has happened from the beginning of the first bank that was formed, you also saw the creation of credit unions, community development corporations that were specifically in neighborhoods that had been marginalized, that had been historically shut out from the financial mainstream. And so communities came together, as communities often do, when there's a gap, to try to fill that gap. And they have been doing that for decades upon decades. So you see, again, the growth of the credit union industry, you see the growth of the CDC industry, but you also see this convergence of those institutions with the civil rights movement. And so many of those institutions were either actively supporting the movement, financing activities in some cases, sheltering, providing the kind of shelter and protection that was often needed. But they all had one common interest, and that was to push for equal rights, to push for economic justice. And it is a theme that continues to this day. Now, we'll talk about what more needs to be done, because like a lot of things, we start, walking in tall cotton, and we forget sometimes where we come from, and the need for, especially the CDFI industry, to go back to those roots, or at least to recapture those roots. But up until even the 1990s, what you saw are these, the evolution and the engagement of these different institutions, and up until the point of 1994, when the REAL Act put into place the CDFI Fund, the creation of the CDFI Fund. You already had these community development financial institutions that were doing the work in the communities for decades, but now you had a vehicle that actually certified these CDFIs, that went through a criteria vetting, if you will, with the Department of Treasury, and said if you are lending in low and moderate communities, but in particular if you're lending in low-income communities, 60% of your lending is being done in that, then you will become a certified CDFI. Of course, there are other criteria as well in terms of governance, accountability, and all of that. But you saw, again, the formation in those early 90s of the certified CDFI industry coming together. Started out with just a handful, a couple hundred. Now has grown to over 1,200 CDFIs located across the country. And you have CDFI banks, CDFI credit unions, CDFI loan funds, CDFI venture capital funds. If you ask any of them what they do or what their mission is, hopefully it's all the same answer, and that is to support underserved communities through affordable access to capital, credit, technical assistance, and other types of support. So it really is this arc that we're going through, I think, that we've seen in terms of the industry and the movement itself. And again, it's a movement that intersects with civil rights, with equal rights, with economic justice. And so our charge, I think, always is how do we make sure that we're staying on track, that we are staying focused, that we're keeping our eyes on the prize, that we're doing what we need to do as organizations, and to recognize and to celebrate that we are very different from banks, and we should be. And my mantra always is that there's a place for each of these institutions. There's a lane for a bank, and there's a lane for a CDFI. And when you see a CDFI acting more like a bank, then that's where you start to question, or you should start to question. And so I'm looking forward to this discussion today about how we can, and you've got these fantastic women here on the panel today who can talk about what we need to do, what concrete steps we need to do to make sure we're staying true to the mission, but also staying true to our history.
Thank you so much for that. So Marla, let's jump right into to that. So from your perspective, what does it mean to recenter civil rights in the CDFI industry?
Thanks, Marissa. I also wanted to echo Donna's comments about how wonderful it is to just be in a full room of human beings. It's really not to be understated just how different the energy is than being in my bedroom behind my computer screen. So it's just great to see you guys and to see old friends as well. So I really think what's interesting sort of about this question and about sort of recentering is the industry, as we've seen it, has really come to a place where sort of larger CDFIs, higher performing CDFIs are lauded as the gold standard. And I really hope that in this conversation we can kind of flip the switch on that a little bit because really sort of what we're celebrating doesn't always align with serving the community that we are intended to serve. And so to me, sort of that sweet spot between serving the community in a culturally competent way, in a community competent way, a community grounded way, while still achieving scale, while still performing, while still not, making unwise decisions with other people's money, that is kind of the sweet spot that we're aiming at. And I think, to Donna's point, when CDFIs begin acting sort of like quasi-banks, that's a really dangerous spot, and it's a real departure from, to my mind, the origin of the CDFI industry and why CDFIs were created. A couple of other points that I wanted to make were that I think, and we'll talk about this later in the panel, but what we measure can also be sort of off base and skewed. So, for any bankers in the room that fund us as CDFIs, I would challenge you to sort of think a little bit differently with regard to how we measure success of CDFIs, and maybe put, if not less emphasis on performance indicators like a healthy portfolio, or to also put emphasis on sort of racial equity, ethnic equity measures as well. And this is mirrored in the new CRA Notice of Proposed Rulemaking, and we'll talk about that as well. But, to keep a lens that includes racial and ethnic equity. And then the last thing that I wanted to say, and we'll, I'm sure, touch on this as well later on, is that in the housing world, we have data that shows discriminatory practices oh goodness, a ghost. So I was just going to say, in the housing world, we have hard data around the discriminatory practices that have happened and can measure if and when those happen moving forward. That does not exist for small business lending. And so, I just want to continue to put pressure on the CFPB to enforce Section 1071 of the Dodd-Frank Act, because while we have self-reported and inferred data around discriminatory practices in small business lending, we just don't have that hard data as a baseline to start from. And so, it's very difficult to say how successful CDFIs are being in the small business space without having that, sort of baseline as a starting point. So I'll move on from there, but those were sort of my initial thoughts around that.
Yeah, well, I think this particular, my mic is off, there you go. This particular point, I think, is so important that I'd love to invite Bulbul and Donna to share a little bit about your perspective on what it means to recenter civil rights in the CDFI industry. So if you want to sort of go first, Bulbul, that would be great.
Sure. So I'm newer to the CDFI industry than probably both of my amazing colleagues here. I came into this role leading a CDFI in California a couple of years ago, having spent 10 to 15 years in the impact investing space before that. And I think for me, coming in and realizing that CDFIs, and having certainly worked with CDFIs before that, but if CDFIs were created out of the tail end of the civil rights legislation, out of a federal acknowledgement of systemic discrimination and redlining in the formal financial industry, then why are we not measured with race affirmative metrics? being colorblind in our industry is like saying all lives matter when someone is saying Black Lives Matter. And that was very eloquently said on a call last week, but I don't have the woman's permission yet to quote her, so I will not take credit for that quote, but I think it really makes the point of why we're here and why we're having this conversation. And that is exactly the kind of language we are pushing for in CRA reform and the CDFI Fund's governance this summer when the comments are open, because if we do not recenter that mission, we are only worsening the black-white and brown-white wealth gap that exists in this country and has worsened since the creation of the CDFI industry, which is perverse, right? That's the opposite of what was intended to happen. So that's why I'm here, and that's why I'm committed to this topic.
So Bobel said it very graciously and very eloquently. You know, I think for me, it's a couple of things. I actually started my career at the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, bank regulatory agency, focused on consumer protection, Community Reinvestment Act, and other areas that were particularly consumer focused. And so I also think that I understand the value, clearly, of financial institutions. I also understand the value of CDFIs. And CDFIs, to me, are like the on-ramp. You're helping folks get to the highway, which might be the financial institution. There are things that CDFIs do beautifully, do very well, but we don't do everything, perhaps, that a bank can do. And the bank has certain levers, I think, of power that relate to how they look at risk, how they mitigate risk, who they access, who they open those doors to in terms of customers, and who they don't. And so for me, kind of recentering really means looking at ways in which we can really be very clear about our role for CDFIs in particular, but also as partners with those banks, true partners with the banks, in opening the doors for people who simply have not had the key for generations, the key to opening up those doors. And so what does that mean? That means that we need to be looking at our own policies, both banks and CDFIs, as it relates to credit. It means that we need to be looking at specific programs that will help create not only wealth, but also close that gap. And for me, it's always been two things. It's always been about home ownership, and it's always been about business, small businesses and business financing. Those are the two standards for me in which you actually can gain wealth and help close that gap. And so what are those concrete steps that need to be taken? Because we talk about closing the gap, but we don't talk about what that really means. What are those steps that are actually going to have to be taken? What are the programs that are going to have to be put into place? What are the policies, frankly, that will have to be either revamped or abolished altogether in order to allow that access to happen? The playing field will not be level until there are some specific aggressive actions to make that happen. And for those of us who are in the financial services industry, we have to look at this as a way in which we are working in partnership to make that happen. In the same way, frankly, that the civil rights movement had this larger umbrella, and folks from different walks of life who look different income classes, different races, we have to look, I think, at what we're doing and saying, what do we need to do to make sure that that umbrella is wide and it includes everybody under there that can really affect change and be serious about it.
And Bobo, I wonder if you can talk a little bit about why this is an important conversation now, and whether under this administration there's even a small window of opportunity for systems change.
Well, we certainly hope so. I think some of us were here maybe last in DC for the President Biden's signing of the racial equity executive order, right? So what does that mean for different agencies to be practicing and embodying that order, not only towards racial equity, but also racial justice, as someone said this morning as well in the affordable housing panel. I think when we think about why is this an important conversation now, right? Donna was talking about the on-ramps to the highway, but is the highway working, right? So if we talk about, she talked about home ownership and business. when we think about even pre-pandemic, 99% of Black entrepreneurs get rejected from formal financial loan applications, pre-pandemic. 95% of Black small business owners were denied access to the PPP through the 2020, right? 41% of Black-owned businesses went under in the first 3 months of the pandemic. So what we're talking about, and in the venture capital space, only 2% of venture capital dollars go to entrepreneurs of color, less than 1% go to women of color, right? So we're talking about if lending isn't working, if venture isn't working, right, what are the forms of capital that are working? I think that remains to be seen. So why are we here? Because none of those streams of capital are working very well for Black people, for brown people, indigenous people, the range of Latinx people, immigrant entrepreneurs who were denied access, for language barriers, all kinds of different streams of capital, right? At the same time, so as a leader, I want to know if half of my customer base, my potential customer base, isn't being served by products and services I'm designing, right? So if I'm the leader of this country, if I'm leaders of these different departments practicing the racial equity executive order, if what I'm putting out in the market isn't resonating with half of my country's population, I'd want to know that. And by 2044, this country is going to be majority people of color. That is in my lifetime. That's when most of our lifetimes, my kids graduate college, right? What does it look like for us to dismantle these systems that haven't worked for our people, to create a new majority that has access to equitable capital to realize their full potential? And when we're talking about wealth building, we're not talking about just getting people to paycheck living, right? We're talking about good jobs where you can actually thrive. So that's why I'm here. I certainly hope it's a systems change moment, but there's a lot of things converging that really show us, like, what does it look like for us to reimagine a financial system where we are empowering the new majority to come into their own and really actually realize equity and not wait for another 100 years for us to actually get to equity. This is a conspiracy, Marissa.
I feel like it is. So kind of with those comments that Bulbul just made in mind, I wonder if you could talk a little bit in more detail about the Black-white wealth gap and some steps that need to be taken. Let's just leave it on the table, maybe, yeah. Yes. Even the laptop is enthralled.
Well, you know, it's a serious gap. I mean, we see again 20%, more than 20%. Your mic. How about now?
Yeah.
Okay, great. So the gap is a serious gap. I mean, we see that the widening gap when you look at the home ownership rate, the fact that for Black homeowners, we are still at that same level that we were when the Fair Housing Act was passed in the early 1960s, a 20% gap between Black and white households. You see it in the wages that are, wage gap that's happening between Black and white families as well. So, I mean, we can keep going on and talking about the numbers. We know that the gap exists. We know that it's a serious gap, and as long as 50% of Black homeowners lost wealth after the 2008 financial crisis. Now, if you're already behind, how do you gain? And it's only been, 15 years since then. If you were already behind a little, somewhat in 2008, you lost 50% of your wealth. We've hit another crisis within the last couple of years. We've had an economic and a health crisis. You can continue to see that Black families, brown households, Black households, indigenous households continue to fall behind. And so it's a gap that can't be ignored. And I think, again, we have to find some really workable solutions to how that gap can be closed. It's real, and it will continue to exist. I look at where I am today, and even in my own family, I mean, my parents probably didn't make more than $10,000 a year in annual salary. Certainly my mother did not. My father, maybe a little bit more than that. He was a laborer at the Department of Treasury, and in a strange twist of fate, I ended up at Treasury. And I think he would have said, he would have never imagined that. But in his lifetime, he never really was able to make economic gains. His daughter happened to make some gains. You know, I had a great salary. I had worked for the FDIC. I worked for, you know, places that were paying me top dollar, certainly within government. But I look at my generation that comes after me, my niece, my nephew, and they're struggling once again. I mean, their annual salary is, I'm trying to figure out how they're even living from day to day, frankly. My niece has a daughter, a 6-year-old, you know, daycare and all of that. So, you know, it really is real for me. It hits home because what I see in them is a regression, not a progression, but a regression. They're making less. They have less affordable places to live. Their job wages are stagnant. And they are living in places where, you know, again, in this beautiful city of Washington, D.C., you cannot find enough affordable housing to accommodate the needs of people who need it the most. So if we, again, I keep saying the same thing over again. I hate to sound like a broken record, but if we do not find concrete ways to address these issues, I worry about not only this generation behind me, but the generations that come after them. And where will we be if, in fact, our children, our grandchildren, our great-grandchildren aren't even able to live in a country, the richest country still in this world, without having a livable wage, an affordable place to live, enough to eat, you know, a good education, affordable health care, all of that. So I don't know if that answers your question, but it's real.
Yeah, no, it is, definitely. I mean, and Marla, I wonder if you could talk a little bit about the Latino white wealth gap and sort of provide some context as well as, you know, how does that differ in ways than it does for the black white wealth gap?
Yeah, so a couple of things. Well, even just with the couching of the question, I think I want to very much underscore that I really think it's important that our communities come together. And so to me, it's less important about sort of like what's the difference between the black and white, you know, income levels, household income versus the Latino and white. You know, I think it's really the disparity is between, you know, racial and ethnic minorities and their white counterparts. So, and I don't think you were trying to make a statement with the question. I just wanted to sort of put that out there.
Yeah, I mean, I think
Yeah.
the thing that folks would hopefully sort of take away is that there are different reasons
Yes,
why these
absolutely.
things exist, and I know that you're well positioned to sort of kind of point out why those things differ.
100%. And I think, you know, the other thing that really was resonating for me when Donna was speaking is that I think our society has gotten to a point where sort of overt racism or overt discrimination is more generally frowned upon, but financial oppression still exists. It very much, you know, is holding us back, and it's much more subtle, much more covert, and so I think this work is so important in terms of, you know, closing that gap and addressing the injustices. But I did want to sort of throw out some points just to understand, you know, exactly where we are in looking at the Latino wealth gap. So, and these are just, I'm just going to throw some stats at you. So Latino household median income is 18% lower than the national median income and 24% lower than the white household median income. Latino men earn 69 cents to the U.S. white man's dollar, and Latinas earn 58 cents to that same dollar. You know, another sort of important point is sort of the vulnerability. You know, so 71% of Latino households are in liquid asset poverty. Therefore, over half of Latino households would be vulnerable if they were faced with an economic shock. They probably would not be able to overcome that. That could be anything from a medical emergency, a divorce, a death in the family, all the things that life throws at us. And so that's, a real vulnerability. The point that I wanted to make that was really shocking to me, and I had not seen this data point before, and it actually came from a report that Diedrich put out, if he's in the room, is that single Latinas from age 18 to 64 have a median wealth of $100. And so I just thought that was unbelievable. And so I think just, the point of these stats is just to say this is real, this is dire, and really, the whole point of this panel is that CDFIs were created to address this, and how well are we addressing it? And so I just really wanted to, put that out there just to underscore the challenges. It's real.
Well, and I think what I hear the two of you saying is also that there are some real serious capital needs for these groups within our communities. And I wonder, Donna, if you can talk a little bit about how establishing the CDFI Fund has helped to provide liquidity and direction for the industry in a way that can help to address some of these, significant gaps.
So when the CDFI, can you hear me?
No.
When the CDFI Fund was created, it was created primarily to provide the kind of capital access for CDFIs. So it still remains the only government agency that is solely devoted to fulfilling the capital needs of CDFIs that are supporting low-income communities. Now, I came in 2007 at a time when the CDFI Fund and other community development agencies within government were being viewed as duplicative and perhaps unnecessary, and that there was a call to combine the different community development agencies. To me, that was the worst thing that could have happened. It didn't happen because the crisis hit, and I think, the financial crisis became the major distraction. But when I came in, the CDFI Fund's budget was $50 million. That's a drop in the bucket. That's pennies compared to what the real need and what the demand was. During the time that I was at the CDFI Fund, I think the appropriations went up to something like $220 million. A drop in the bucket compared to what the demands were. And so what you saw just recently, certainly with the administration's support of getting more funding into the CDFI Fund, even the $3 billion that has been set aside, that's separate from the $9 billion that went to MDIs, is a drop in the bucket. So we need to be thinking about, I think, for the CDFI Fund, I think there has been great strides made, great accomplishments made, but there's still more that needs to be done. And the fact that they are still the only agency within government specifically targeted, focused on CDFIs with, to me, a very, very limited budget, that you can only do so much with what you have. And that means that for the time that I was there, and I know certainly when Annie Donovan succeeded me and now Jody Harris at the helm, what we spent that appropriations on, 90% of that went to awards, to grants. 10% was for staffing and research and compliance and certification. It was never enough. There was never enough staff. There was never enough funding to support additional staff. And so I think when we look at the role of the CDFI Fund, there's still an important role, a critical role that they play. But we need to be, I think, great encouragers and advocates to making sure that Congress understands they need a lot more money to do the work that's supported by the great work that CDFIs are doing all across this country.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, so Marla, despite the fact that there are these sort of serious capital needs still for CDFIs. What makes them well-suited to meet the needs of underserved communities?
So I'm sure I'm preaching to the choir, with what I'm about to say. I mean, I think particularly now, PPP was a test that proved exactly the positioning and the uniqueness of CDFIs to respond quickly. I think the unique position of CDFIs in terms of being entrenched in community is very different than traditional financial service providers, just in terms of the depth of understanding of what's going on in communities, the cultural competency, ideally the reflecting back, in terms of the staff of the organization. So I've taken it upon myself, starting this calendar year, to come up with analogies for various things that I'm talking about on panels. It's kind of just a self-challenge thing, but I came up with this one, and I think it's actually accurate, which is that the difference between CDFIs and traditional financial service providers is that, your traditional commercial banks are the individual sending the child support check, whereas the CDFI is the parent that's at home and knows exactly how that check needs to be spent. And so, whereas the check is very, very important, and without it, little can be done, the parent that is at home that knows, school books need to be purchased, a uniform needs to be purchased, we need this much for groceries, we need this, or there's, something coming up that isn't, the typical thing on this month. Summer camps are coming, whatever it might be. Obviously, I'm a parent, so I, have these things near. Summer camp is like in my head, the thousands of dollars that are going to be spent on summer camp. But, so I just think that the depth of understanding is the understanding of what's going on in the community. And I don't know, that's my fear, is that as CDFIs grow, that touch and contact with the community can be lost. I'm not saying that it has to be lost, but it can be lost, and that is a dangerous sort of point, a teetering to be on. So as much as we can grow and serve more clients while still having that understanding of what, Joe on the corner is facing, and I don't know that I have the answer to how to do that, but that's kind of, that's there. And then I had another thing that I wanted to say just real quick around, because in my current position, I fund CDFIs, but we are also a CDFI. And so, and also having run a community-based CDFI, I know that it's also challenging to, just as it's challenging for the end beneficiary or the client, the small business owner, the consumer borrower to access financial services for, particularly for minority-led CDFIs, it's challenging to get funding to run programs or even to deploy out in the community. And so I just wanted to put out there that there are over 1,000 CDFIs. There are less than 100 Latino-led CDFIs. And that is a big disconnect if you're talking about who's being served versus who's serving. And so, I just wanted to put that out there because that's where we could improve, I believe.
Thank
Can
you.
I just
Yeah, please.
tag on to that? Because in the same way that Marla talks about the small number of Latino-led CDFIs, you're seeing, again, the same sort of thing with Black-led CDFIs as well. So Linwood Long, who is not here today, and I am so sorry that he missed, his plane was canceled. He was coming out of North Carolina. But he, Inez Long, who is the CEO of the Black Business Investment Fund of Florida, and I formed an organization 4 years ago called the African American Alliance of CDFI CEOs. And we did that primarily because what we were seeing was that even within the industry itself, there was disparity with how Black-led CDFIs were receiving investments, the types of investments, the amount of investments. And I remember telling Linwood that I was in a room with one of my colleagues who I treasure dearly, and he was talking about this $10 million investment that he was just getting from one of the banks. And I thought, wow, what must that be like just to be, he said, oh, no, we didn't go through much underwriting. And I said, you didn't? And he said, no, we've had this relationship with them for years. And so it just drew a fine point for me on just what those disparities are. Hope Enterprise Corporation, the Delta, I love Bill Bynum and the work that his organization does. They have a policy institute, and they did a study, an analysis a few years ago that showed where that disparity was for minority-led CDFIs, and the difference between those that were minority-led and white-led, just in terms of CDFI Fund awards, but also investments themselves. And it was like a 5-to-1 difference. I mean, it was white-led CDFIs were getting 5 times the amount of investments that minority-led CDFIs were. So it really, I think, clarified for us why we needed to come together. As a group, we are a group of CDFI, Black-led CDFI loan funds executives. There are 60 loan funds that are members of ours, and that doesn't include, of course, the banks and credit unions. But again, still a small number when you look at us compared to the rest of the industry. And one of our main focuses has been not only advocating for these CDFIs, many of whom are small, but again, doing yeoman's work day in and day out in these communities, advocating for those small CDFIs, but also advocating for changes in public policies, the way that policies are actually put into place that are not necessarily friendly in terms of the investments that are going into those CDFIs across government, but also the role that private sector must play as well. I mean, we are talking about both public sector and private sectors that need to better understand the investments and what these investments do, and to build those relationships in a way that they have not done to date. So I'm proud to be part of that. And as I said, I'm sorry that Linwood isn't here, because Linwood is a well, I was going to say he's a former pastor. Once you're a pastor, you never give up your vocation. But he would be here preaching today, for sure, about the need to really continue to, put the metal to the pedal, or the pedal to the metal, whatever the saying is, for us to keep pushing forward, because we can't stop. We cannot stop.
If I could just say one quick, hello? 2-second advertisement that NALCAB is launching or has launched formally in partnership with and friendship and sorority or brotherhood with AAA or the Alliance. We are launching the National Alliance of Latino CDFI Executives, called NALCE. So it's a little bit different because we had already convened a group of CDFIs within our membership. So within our 170 members, we have about 55 CDFIs, but this is kind of a fence around that group for exactly the same purposes: for advocacy, for investment, for peer learning, for just moving the field ahead. But we very much anticipate and have already worked in partnership with the Alliance, so I don't want it to seem divisive, but there you go. Alliances and alliances between alliances. Yeah.
And another area that is, I would say, less explored for CDFIs, but which there's a need for more engagement, is around impact investment work. And Bulbul, you've talked in the past about decolonizing capital through your own investment work at your fund. I wonder if you can talk about how impact investments have the potential to affect a real change in democratizing the sort of finance landscape.
Thanks. And I'm still hunting for more Asian American CDFI CEOs out there to start our own little alliance-friendly group. So if any one of you know any Asian American CDFI CEOs, please email me. But yes, so one interesting note, I think we do not talk about this often enough at all in the impact investing industry, is that similarly to the origins of the CDFI Fund, impact investing was formed out of its origins traced back to the early 1800s, similarly to what Donna was describing earlier. It was born out of the movement in the UK to divest from the enslavement of blacks and the enslavement of labor practices and slave plantations. And we have lost, again, and I'm beating a dead horse perhaps, but we have become colorblind as an industry because the majority of assets held in this world are still held by white asset owners. And while impact investing was formed officially about 14 years ago, out of two sort of major practice changes from the traditional financial industry. One was that we were going into investments with an intentionality of having social or environmental impact, and the other was that we were going to measure the outcomes of our investment to make sure that they aligned with the social and environmental impact outcomes we intended going into that investment. PCV, my organization, Pacific Community Ventures, was one of the first impact investing funds in this country. And so we became a CDFI about 8 years ago. So when I look at, how do we go back to the roots of both impact investing and CDFIs in the organization that I run, decolonizing that to me means, one, dismantling practices that work for white majority asset owners that don't necessarily come from community and work for people of color. Looking at, are the outcomes of my investment working, right? Are they meeting the goal that I set out to meet? And that's part of why, we're here having this conversation, because it's one thing for the CDFI fund to be created, to have some assets, as Donna was describing, not sufficient yet, but to have some assets to meet that goal. But if we're not measuring the outcomes of those investments, are we improving the black-white wealth gap or the people of color to white wealth gap? No, right? We're worsening it. We've worsened it in the last 30 years in this country, on top of 400 years of not having that access to capital. So in decolonizing our capital, how are we decolonizing our underwriting practices, right? To not only be intentionally inclusive, because we use that word really broadly, but also where are we being unintentionally punitive? What are we asking for that we do not need to be asking for to get to a yes? One of our first values at PCV is coming from a place of yes, and this is probably where we bake it in more than anywhere else, is really looking for reasons to not have to say no. I hope I didn't do a double negative there, but you know what I mean. And democratizing access to our capital, both on our, for us on our lending side of the CDFI fund, but loan fund, but also on the mentorship program that we run nationwide. And when I think about what that looks like, that is inherently in the impact world a blended capital model for reparative capital, right? So CDFIs, if we were formed to address a market failure of the banking industry, we are inherently, in order to address market failure, you can't address market failure with market-based approaches and market return approaches, right? Because then, similarly to what Donna was saying earlier, you end up acting, and Marla, too much like the banks that you were meant to disrupt. And we've forgotten the disruptive part, I think, in the way that we are governed at least, tends to lean towards being so intentionally inclusive that it becomes colorblind. And that's where I think when I think about where are there impact investing best practices that we bring, absolutely the measurement part is something that I really take deeply into where we are with both the CDFI fund and the CRA reform opportunity to think about how are we baking in better data collection and measurement to make sure that we are really looking at designing the right product and the right service and actually measuring, is it having its intended impact, and if not, making different decisions. But we don't know the answer to Marla's point earlier. In the housing industry, you have at least more disclosure, and with HMDA especially. And we're not doing enough yet on the CFPB side with the Section 1071 in collecting race disaggregated data in small business lending, and we absolutely need to. Yeah.
I'm stepping in as moderator here because I've always been fascinated by what your organization and under your leadership has done. And you've done it in ways that I know other CDFIs are doing it, but I think just talking with you and working with you probably a year ago when we were co-authoring that article, can you just talk a little bit, because I think it's really important as an industry for us to also turn that mirror on ourselves and say, okay, we may not be able to make drastic changes today in how we look at our credit policies, our underwriting, our credit scores and things like that, but there's a place where you can start. So I know that you all certainly started even longer than a year ago. Can you talk a little bit about what you saw as the pieces that needed to be fixed within the organization so that you could better serve the population or the communities?
Sure, thanks for asking. So one of the first things that we did is look at our underwriting and look at what were we, if we're a small business lender, we're doing non-bank, non-SBA lending. We are not a collateral-based lender, so why are we asking for collateral? Why are we asking about collateral? Two, we found in our research that entrepreneurs of color tend to underreport personal assets, whether it is because they don't deem their assets as worthy enough, worth reporting, or because they are suspicious if a loan goes south, they will be seized, probably both, right? We can imagine. Why are we asking that if we know it is going to disincentivize them from applying or from getting the capital? Why is it part of our scoring? So really intentionally looking through our underwriting and taking out anything that was unnecessary to get to a yes, and then rescoring our underwriting to really make sure it was matching what we bare minimum needed to get to yes. Two, it was also looking at, were we doing a blend of micro and small business lending to make sure we were building the pipeline, working better with micro lenders in our community to really make sure we were building a better continuum of capital. How do we start to share diligence behind the scenes, which is our next couple of steps. And also, really frankly, I'm the first person of color who's ever led PCV. And we've gone through a pretty tough transformation in the last couple of years, having tough conversations and intentionally saying to ourselves, if this has been colorblind for so long, we're impact investors. If we're not collecting the outcomes of our data based on what we're supposed to be measuring, we're not going to know if we're meeting the mission or not. So we've gone in the last 2 years from deploying about 65% of our capital to entrepreneurs of color and women to 90% as of the end of 2021. And we are collecting race disaggregated for the first time in the last 2 years. We know 30% of our capital goes to Black entrepreneurs, 20% is going to Latinx entrepreneurs, it's so on and so forth, and intentionally measuring that. So, so that way we know what we need to improve on. We did our first earned media placed multi-language translation last year when we launched our Oakland Restorative Fund. And again, that's out of small grant dollars, right? But knowing that the PPP didn't reach many of our communities because of language barriers, and hearing from our community partners that they needed Spanish, Vietnamese, Cantonese, Tagalog, et cetera, we intentionally used grant dollars to launch in different languages right from the get-go and building advisors who are ready to support in languages. But that's a blended capital model. I'm not getting money from the CDFI Fund to do that. I'm not getting money from my investors to do that, which shouldn't be the case, right? So those are some of the things we've done.
Yeah, I'd love to sort of dig in a little bit more to what you mentioned earlier, Bulbul and Donna. And for you, Donna, you were talking about being concerned about when CDFIs begin to act too much like banks. And so I wonder if you can talk a little bit about how CDFIs can sort of lean into CRA to help them hold true to mission, to increase capital that's provided to them from banks, and to better serve the communities that they're intending to serve.
Yeah. Well, this is a perfect time because CRA is going through a reform. And unlike the last effort a few years ago, the bank regulatory agencies are pretty much aligned, in sync, working together, and I think are very interested in getting comments. And I tell people all the time, don't send in, I realize it's easy to send in the standard template letter, but be personal about it. Really talk about what's happening in your community, because I think when you look at CRA, there are things about it that won't change. It's going to be lending, investment, and services, time and time again. And how does CRA make an even deeper impact in those communities that we are supporting? And so, my own personal opinion is that I think the regulators almost went too far to the other side a few years ago because they said, well, if you're a small institution, we're not going to come in as often. We're not going to examine you as much. You're going to have a more streamlined examination process. And I think in many ways it actually worsened the impact of CRA, because I think there were a lot of institutions, not all of them, but a lot of institutions who said, hey, I'm just doing the bare minimum. I'm getting a satisfactory CRA rating. I don't want to get an outstanding. We're perfectly fine where we are. We're going to stay in this little space and just and operate. And I think that there was some missed opportunities. Because I think there are some banks that say, we want to go beyond CRA. We're just trying to figure out how to do that. And so there is an opportunity now with CRA reform to really make it even more meaningful than it has before. I think that we have skirted around this issue of race in CRA for much too long. Your redlining, CRA came about because of redlining. I mean, I remember folks like Gail Sincata and others who talked about what was happening in neighborhoods in Chicago and other places. And throughout this country where folks of black and brown hue simply could not move into neighborhoods where others have been because of the very strict real estate laws that were in place. And so I think now is an opportunity to acknowledge that, yes, when we talk about low income, we may be talking about different races, but we also, as part of that, talking about whether it's low income, moderate income, or another income, we're also talking about marginalized people who are black and brown, indigenous as well. And CRA, I think, has to finally recognize that this is an issue that needs to be addressed, and it can be addressed through reform of this legislation, of this act. Lending, investment in services. This is what it's all about in our communities. This is what we do day in and day out. We make loans. We provide investments and grants and others to organizations that provide that cushion that helps elevate the work that CDFIs are doing. The services, the financial services, and looking at ways in which you stem the flow of branch leakage, of branch closings in these communities that still rely on brick and mortar. Not everybody is digital. Not everything is digital. And technology is wonderful, but how do you continue to serve those communities where people expect to go up to a teller and have a face-to-face conversation and face-to-face interaction? So I say all that to say that I hope that everybody in this room really is very thoughtful about providing the comments and providing some real recommendations, some real thoughtful recommendations about how the Community Reinvestment Act can really better serve the communities that we serve. Because when we talk about this being once in a lifetime, once in a generation in terms of what's happening in this country today, CRA is just as important as everything else that's going on. As we look at the economy, as we look at, the communities that have been hard hit by COVID, this becomes just as important. This should be at the top of our list.
Thank you. Marla, earlier you said what gets measured gets managed. I'd love if you could sort of talk just a little bit about how some of the metrics that CDFIs are managed by are helpful or a hindrance in accomplishing what we're trying to set out to do here.
Absolutely, and I quickly wanted to follow up on Donna's call to action. I believe there's something set up in the hallway where people can actually comment.
There is actually, as folks come off of the escalator area to your right, there's a CRA comment station.
And if you're interested in being part of a sign-on letter that's actually intentionally trying to center race and race disaggregated data collection, we're working on one with the African American Alliance of CDFI CEOs, so please come see me as well if you're interested.
And I will say, if there's a point that you're looking to drive home that's just kind of a broad point, is that the proposed rule looks solely at income as a lens. There is not a racial equity lens for evaluating CRA activies. And so I would just, if you just want to drive one point home, I think that's the big one. That being said, there are some good things there in the sense that any activity with CDFIs is is worthy or eligible. And then also the focus on Native and rural communities, sort of calling that out is different. So those are, I didn't want to make it sound like it was all bad, nor did you, but that one kind of oversight of a very big, piece of the work that we do needs to be stated. But to answer your question, Marissa, around sort of what's measured, I think there is a conflict between what's measured and how we can be successful in centering CDFI work, as a civil rights activity. And so, what is being measured? What is lauded? Scale, performance of the portfolio, the level of risk taken. All of these don't exactly jive with successfully carrying out the mission of a CDFI. And so I think we really need to re-examine that and think about different ways that we can measure activities. I know, certainly increasingly we're looking at sort of who's receiving those loans, what was the pricing on those loans, what was the term offered and extended on that loan. Even for CDFIs, we should be, looking at ourselves and seeing what we're doing. I think the thing that's interesting is that, funders always want to look, and how ironic, the people who fund our work do our work for a living, so they understand it. They have their own criteria of success, and therefore those are sort of overlaid on top of CDFIs. And the challenge is, we actually should not be lauded for having perfect, performance in our portfolios. We should not be lauded for having zero, loans par, under 30, or that is actually in conflict with the reason for being of CDFIs. And so actually Donna and I sit on the OFN board, and we had a lively conversation in our board meeting around how wonderful that OFN's portfolio is performing so well, but should we be making some riskier deals? Does this mean that we're not extending loans out to sort of smaller, less established, less known, less proven CDFIs? And so, I think maybe it's a set aside, maybe whatever it might be within the CDFI where you're kind of doing that. I know the CDFI that I used to run had a scoring system for each deal that came through, and I think that was really helpful in terms of balancing our portfolio. So it wasn't to say that only the A's would get through. We wanted to know, okay, we've got 25% A++, 25% D, 25, and that was a healthy portfolio from our point of view, because it meant that we were covering all of our bases. I'm not saying do not make healthy performing loans, but I do think there's a room for balance rather than putting all of the eggs. And I think if and when we go into a recession, we'll see what happened, in 2007, 2008, where folks who could have gotten bank loans in the past are now coming to CDFIs, which then totally skews the system, because then you have, these amazingly performing CDFI portfolios that are basically made up of like the people who were just a hair below that bank credit box. And so, I just would challenge all of us to really think about how to convey or how to spin the negative as a positive, because if you make a loan that defaults, it's still a loan that wouldn't have been made by a bank, and it still should be celebrated. So
yeah. And I mean, just to add to that, to be frank, what that does to CDFI is measuring us similarly to bank financial health solvency metrics, is force us to act more like the banks we were meant to disrupt. And I have seen in my community in Oakland where that breaks trust with community partners who look at us like, you guys were supposed to meet us. Like, you failed us too. If we can't even rely on you to meet our community's needs, then why the hell do you exist?
Yep.
Like, what's the point? I'm gonna go do this myself and not be a CDFI. And that actively breaks trust in government and the role we are supposed to be playing, right? So I really appreciate, because it's hard to say some of this stuff when perversely the majority of funding to CDFIs still comes from the same banks we were meant to disrupt. So we inherit the colonizer rates, terms, rules, restrictions into our industry that we then have to perpetuate to communities that we were meant to solve that for. And that is why we are calling for CRA reform, as well as the CDFI fund, to not only be race affirmative to meet their intended mission for why they were founded, but also to collect race disaggregated data and to change their metrics to not just be 60% LMI capital, but also be 60% BIPOC focused. Because we are not going to get to equity with colorblind approaches.
Well, thank you. So on that note, we'd love to invite any questions from the group. If you can, there's a stand mic here if you want to kind of take a spot, and we'll get through as many questions as we can in the remaining time.
Okay, thank you. My name is John Verow. I work for a bank. We do a lot of investments in CDFIs as well as lending to them and providing grants through the foundation. But one thing that I've sort of noticed in talking to some local CDFIs as well as some black-owned banks in my area, they're actually having trouble getting all the money out the door. And I heard you earlier, and I agree with what you were saying, that we need to do more. But have y'all heard that? I'm just curious. And a lot of that is, you know, just all the money is funneled down over the last couple of years and from non-traditional sources like the PayPals and other places. So I'm just...
I'll just have a quick answer to that. I think part of that challenge is that most investors want to invest debt into CDFIs rather than also offset operational expenses that are needed to deploy that debt. And so there's a disconnect there. And I think, you know, a huge service to CDFIs would be operational grants that would then allow them to staff up, deploy that money. You know, that's the challenge is you have a very liquid fund and you don't have enough staff to deploy that money. And so I don't think it's a reflection of the need, it's a reflection of the capacity of the organization to deploy the capital.
It's also rates. If banks are lending capital to us at rates that are higher than what our communities can afford, there will not be as much demand for that, especially in the hesitancy to take on more debt right now with communities that have been disproportionately hit by health and debt costs as well. So we need that capital to blend with the rates that we are able to access to offer what the community actually needs. And we have a $10 million pipeline at PCV that I'm trying to raise capital to meet because we're slashing our rates for the community, but not accessing capital at rates I can't afford to take.
And I understand that, but in this case, it's actually been equity investments. And so, and I think it goes maybe back to your point, having an optimal leverage structure on the liability side. And so I think there is something missing because it sounds like, you know, I don't know if it's deposits, do they need more deposits, if they're getting a lot of capital, you know, from an equity perspective. And so I'm just not quite sure, but there's something not quite matching up.
Hangover of COVID funding as well, which will not perpetually be here. You know, is that a lot of organizations, you know, the irony of the industry that we're in is that crises put us in our best position. So that might be it too.
You'll probably start to see that change. The demand hasn't changed. It's the ability for some of those institutions to get that debt quickly out the door. As the other types of support, you know, programs, you see that starting to decrease. That demand will increase even more, and I think you'll again start to see some leveling out. Thank you. But I certainly hear from some banks that, you know, they can't take any more deposits right now because they've been so deposit rich as a result of COVID as well. But it's a capacity issue. I think it's, you know, you need resources to move debt out the door.
Thank you.
My name is Zarqa Abed, and I'm from Columbus, Ohio. And I lead an organization which is basically addressing human trafficking, drugs, gangs, violence, gun violence in youth. Columbus is second largest community for Somali population, Somali refugees. My question is, do you have any good model that has really built the capacity for refugees program. Because I hear minority, I hear Black, I have been an NCRC member for a long time now. I've been in meetings. We have been given some time to talk about a little bit about refugees. But really, I mean, I'm the only organization right now from Ohio led by an immigrant person. My background is media. I had to look up CFDC and all of this last year when I became a member of NCRC. Many of my community members, leaders, don't understand what is out there. When the refugees come from Afghanistan, Syria, and all of these places, we don't really know how to help them. So really, we need to know if there is a model that has been adapted anywhere in the country that can help us, who can help our people. The refugees that come are many, many very professional people, highly qualified to run a business, and they can be very successful in very short time, and we are really given the proper, and we have built the capacity. So I really want to look into NCRC's leadership and all of you who you have done some talk about different races, and I appreciate that. But really, we really need to have this as a separate policy, and we really need to work, and I'm here to work with you or to learn from you whatever could be done. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that question. I really appreciate it. I think the languages piece is one thing we've been talking about with immigrant and refugee populations. I know in my community in Oakland, there's a couple of organizations that are particularly trying to change at least state policy in California and leveraging being able to make loans to folks who don't have a social security number, who are undocumented. I think that's one piece of one for some refugee populations. I also know, so African Development Center, I think it's called, ADC in Minnesota, also works with a lot of Somali refugees. And I think that's, I'm just starting to get to know them better, but I think they've really carved out really interesting I think it's mostly micro lending, but particularly to Somali refugees, that might be an interesting conversation, at least for you to brainstorm sort of a similar model and what's worked for them. But happy to put you in touch with them if that's helpful.
And I would also add that Mission Asset.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
These like not. The
Yeah.
mic is like not working.
Jose?
Mission Asset Fund in the Bay Area, yes, has a model that would probably be of interest. It's immigrant focused, not specifically refugee focused, but on helping to fund the naturalization process, because it's extraordinarily expensive to be in poverty in general, and worse so if you're an immigrant trying to pay for that process to become a naturalized U.S. citizen. So that maybe addresses part of the thing that you were talking about, but would be happy to put you in touch with them as well.
Yeah.
Thank you.
And there's also an organization in New York, the name escapes me at the moment, but they have spent most of they're a CDFI, spent most of their tenure working with refugees and settlements. So we need to get your,
Yes.
yes,
Yes,
Yankee,
okay,
Yankee,
they have a new name, a company.
yes.
It-
There we go.
And the group that Donna was talking about is called a company capital, a company capital.
I'm writing
Yeah,
this down.
they changed their name.
Yeah, so I think we have time maybe for one more question. Yeah, I mean,
Okay, I had a question and just an observation. I'm here with my colleague Kerwin Brown from the state of Arizona. Just a quick snapshot, 7 million people. We only have 13 community banks. We have 16 CDFIs, 8 of them tribal, 8 of them non. 3 of them look suspiciously like banks. Extreme lack of access to capital. More than 90% of our money is deposited in non-local banks. 76% of our money is just in Chase, Wells, and B of A. 76% of our total deposits. So it is truly, we're in a difficult situation. So my question is, I only know enough to be dangerous, and I'm trying to come up with ideas. We've been very active with the CRA. What do you think of the idea of tying the CRA requirements to the percent of holdings that they have by state? In other words, in a state that has so much money in these banks and they're advocating to not give back, in our state it's outrageous. And so I wondered, you have big brains and you're in this space. What do you think of that idea? And then second, my observation is just being members of NCRC and being out here, I have to say it really was deflating to see all of these logos on these sponsor lists for well, all the people who got us here, the very evil core, and I know you have to take that money, but damn it, we don't have to let their logos go on anything. And anyone in this room that wants to fight for a just economy, you cannot have your money in one of those banks and fight for a just economy. So I just wanted to share that as an observation.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. And I know there were a few people who had questions, and I'd love for us to maybe, if I can invite my colleagues here, we can, collect in the hall, and that way the next session can get ready to be able to get started. But that way you get your
Actually, it's
question
lunch
answered.
after this, so no session.